Let's start our first official organ system, the integumentary system. We'll look at some introductory concepts and then at the most superficial layer of the skin, which we call the epidermis. So, here's some stuff about the skin that will help you realize that there's a lot going on in the skin, and stuff in the skin is very small. Like every minute, you're losing tens of thousands of skin cells. They're just making layers of dead parts of you all over your car and your house. Lots of tiny hairs on your head and all over your body. And in just 1 square inch of skin, you have meters and meters of nerve fibers and blood vessels, and or more sweat glands, and millions of cells in just 1 square inch. So your skin accomplishes a lot. Here are just some of the functions of your integumentary system, starting with protection. That can mean protection from pathogens, like just keeping bacteria and viruses out of your body, protection from UV radiation, from trauma. You wouldn't want to, damage your muscle every time you bumped into a doorway. Protection from harmful chemicals and from desiccation, from drying out. The integumentary system is also involved in thermoregulation. So, if you are exercising and your body begins to get warmer, you might feel that heat like up in your face or neck. A lot of blood is being moved to the superficial parts of your skin through vasodilation. But if your body is getting cold, those superficial blood vessels will constrict through vasoconstriction and keep that blood in your core. Sweat is also a tool for thermoregulation. The skin is involved in sensation and excretion. When you sweat, you actually are excreting certain compounds. And the skin is also involved in the synthesis of vitamin D, which we'll talk about very briefly. So, a lot is happening in the skin. Spin you. There we are. So, this is just to try to make sure you realize, even when we start to look at fairly simplified models to understand the structures and functions of the skin is very busy. There's many layers, there's many structures, and even this is a gross oversimplification of the complexity of the skin. Now, I've been saying integumentary system and skin a little bit interchangeably, so we should be careful with our wording here. The integumentary system has two major parts. There's the skin, which we call the cutaneous membrane, and then there are the accessory structures like the hair, glands, and nails. And when we look at the skin actually has two layers. There's the epidermis and the deeper dermis. The hypodermis is not really officially part of the skin. It has some other names that maybe would be better at helping us remember it's not an official part of the skin. On the other hand, we'll talk about hypodermis in this chapter because there's really no other good time to talk about the hypodermis. But we'll get to that later. Okay, now here's a list of many of the structures that we'll be learning about in the next few videos. It's not every structure, and there are some additional concepts, but these are really the major structures that you'll be looking for in the skin and especially on some skin models. So this is kind of the classic skin model, and it also shows the hypodermis, so I call it the skin and hypodermis model. And by looking at this, one of the things you'll notice right away is there's clearly some different parts to this model where things look a little different. And then there's also some lines they put in separating parts of the model. So before we talk about all the parts of the skin, let's get oriented to this model. Most of this model is showing thin skin, but one region is showing thick skin. And what we're saying here is that there's this very superficial top layer of your epidermis, and sometimes it's very thick, like on the soles of your feet or on the palms of your hand, but other times it's very thin. Like I can't even really see that top pink layer in this other thinner skin. And thin skin is everywhere else in your body. So that's thin skin versus thick skin. But this model, it's actually labeled with specific parts of the body. So it's saying that there's a part of this model showing thin skin of the scalp. There's a part of this model showing the thin skin of the axillary region. And then there's some thick skin on the sole of the foot. So the reason this is important is that if you look at this model carefully, you'll notice that, well, all this thin skin has hair, only the axillary region has this special gland. So there's something different going on there we need to understand. And of course, thick skin has this thick top layer, but there are no hair follicles here. So it is important when you're looking at this model, or really any skin model or diagram or histological preparation, you want to try to figure out, where do I think this is coming from in the body? Because it'll tell you what structures to be looking for or maybe not looking for. Okay, let's move on to the epidermis, this most superficial layer of the skin. And the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and it can be keratinized or non-keratinized. And keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue is your outer skin. So just about anywhere you can look on your own body, that will be keratinized. So that just means that the cells have this protein called keratin that helps make the skin tough and helps make it water resistant. This is good to protect us from trauma, from pathogens, from drying out, and so on. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue forms your inner skin. So like most of the inside of your oral cavity is non-keratinized. Anus and vagina, non-keratinized. The tissue is still very thick. There's layers and layers and layers and layers of squamous cells. So that's still good. It still helps protect you from trauma and from pathogens and so on. It's not as rough, and maybe it's not as efficient, but you wouldn't want the inside of your mouth or vagina or anus to be very dry and very rough, because at some point you might want something to go in or out of one or more of those places, and it needs to be able to go through easily. Another characteristic, not just of the epidermis, but of epithelial tissue, is that it's avascular. There are no blood vessels or capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, weaving their way through the tissue to deliver nutrients and collect waste. So how is the epidermis taken care of? Well, it relies on the dermis to take care of it. So we'll talk about that when we get into the dermis. What kind of cells are found in the epidermis? Mostly keratinocytes. They are the most abundant type of cell. They're the durable and water-resistant cells. They start deep in the epidermis where they're made, and then they migrate to the surface, as we'll talk about next. And at that point, they're dead, and over time they'll be sloughed off. Right? Sometimes you can see this happening, like if you have a little bit of dry skin that's like stuck in your eyebrow or something. Yeah, that's dead keratinocytes that are being sloughed off. There are also Merkel cells in the epidermis. Those are sensory cells. We'll talk about them later with some other sensory structures. There are Langerhans cells. These are immune cells that just wander around through the epidermis, eat up anything that shouldn't be there. And there are melanocytes. Those are creating melanin to help protect you from the UV radiation from the sun. They make that melanin, they transfer it to the keratinocytes. We'll talk about that in detail in another portion of the video. And one more thing about the epidermis is that it is a layer of skin, but itself, it is made of sublayers. So thick skin has 5 sublayers, and thin skin only has 4 of those sublayers. So the layers of the epidermis are the stratum basale, that's the deepest layer, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, stratum corneum. So we'll talk about each of these. Stratum, by the way, just means like a layer. Like the stratosphere is a layer of the atmosphere. Or if you're more into geology, if you're in a canyon or something and there's bands of color on the rocks, those are strata. So it's all about, just means layers. Okay, now here is some histology of the epidermis. And the first thing I want you to notice is this wavy line going down and up and down and up. If you see that line, you should know you're looking at the skin. If I go back and look at a model, we can see that wavy line up and down, up and down, up and down. Now, you'll probably know this model is skin, but if you look into a microscope at some point and you see a tissue that you're not sure what it is, look for that wavy line. And you'll know that anything below that wavy line is the dermis, and everything above it is the epidermis. So let's look at these 5 layers of the epidermis. Stratum basale is the base layer. Now this is just like the base of a mountain. It's the bottom part, but the other way it's like the base of this mountain, K2, is that these climbers are going to start here and they are going to migrate their way up to the surface, to the top. That's what happens with stratum basale. This is where you have epidermal stem cells that are dividing, and one of the cells will stay and the other will migrate up to the surface of your skin over several weeks. Also down in the stratum basale are some melanocytes and those Merkel cells for sensation. It's just this one row of cells is stratum basale. Okay, next, stratum spinosum. Spinosum means spiny, so this is the spiny layer. Now, officially, it gets its name because in certain histological preparations, these cells you'll see little spines on them. But I suggest think about the defensive abilities of spines, because the stratum spinosum is mostly about defense, meaning that the Langerhans cells we talked about are found here. Remember, they wander around and eat up anything that shouldn't be there through phagocytosis. But also, the keratinocytes here are bound together very tightly by desmosomes. So hopefully you remember desmosomes from the previous unit. But if you had these cells that were just next to each other, stuff could squeeze in between those cells and invade your body. So these desmosomes help the cells tightly attach and make a much better defensive layer. So stratum spinosum, pretty thick layer, all up in here is mostly for defense. Next is stratum granulosum. Granulosum means this is the granular layer. So what are granules? They are little bits of onion. They are little bits of whatever they put on your shingles, on those asphalt shingles. They are little bits of medicine inside pills and so on. They're little bits of stuff. So these cells that started down in stratum basale and have made their way more and more superficial, at this point, those cells are now full of these little factories, and they're making bits of stuff called keratin. The keratin, remember, will make your skin very durable and tough. These factories are also making keratohyalin, and that's really what makes your skin water resistant. Maybe not waterproof. If you soak in a bathtub for a while and you see your skin wrinkle, that's because the water is getting into your skin. But you're pretty water resistant thanks to keratohyalin. The thing about stratum granulosum is that these cells are so busy making keratin and making more factories to make more keratin, and then more factories to make more keratin, that they neglect the rest of their cellular duties. And in fact, they'll just make keratin until they die, which is great because these dead cells will have so much keratin, they're going to be really good and durable to help protect you. So now these cells are dead, and they're just going to continue to move up through the last two layers as other cells from below are pushing them from below. The next layer is stratum lucidum. This is the layer that's only found in thick skin. And it's just this very thin layer that separates the stratum granulosum from the stratum corneum. Lucid, by the way, is like clear thinking, right? If your patient is lucid, then they're clear thinking. Or this picture came from lucid dreaming, where you're dreaming, but your thinking is relatively clear. And histologically, you want to look for a very thin, clear white streak. You really got to know it's there and look for it because it's very small. So that brings us to the last layer of the epidermis, the most superficial layer, stratum corneum. Cornu means horn. This isn't a great one. I mean, if you know about a cornucopia, it's shaped like a horn. This is the horny or horn-like layer. My guess is it's named after horns on some animals are very durable and tough, and also they're made of keratin. So our skin is durable and tough at the stratum corneum, just like the horn of a wild beast. These cells are all dead. They're still interlocked thanks to those desmosomes. So sometimes when you shed the skin, when it sloughs off, you get big chunks. That's because the desmosomes are holding all the cells onto each other. This layer is dry, it's water resistant, and it took a few weeks for the cells to actually reach the stratum corneum. Then they'll hang around for a few more weeks, but eventually pieces will fall off. So histologically, you want to look for these flaky bits up at the top. It will help you know that that's the apical surface, the top surface of the stratum corneum. And just looking at our model, there's basale, that one row of cells at the very bottom. Then spinosum, granulosum. They made a nice white line for stratum lucidum, only in thick skin. And last is stratum corneum, which is also found in thin skin, but it's very thin layer. So how will you remember the names of these layers of the epidermis? Well, this is a good time to have a mnemonic device to at least give you the first letter of each of the strata in the proper order. So here's some you can choose from. I think can't let good skin burn. That's pretty good. The only thing I don't like about these mnemonics is that I like to think about the journey of the keratinocyte. Its birth in the stratum basale, and then all these events it goes through, as it makes friends and it migrates up, and then it dies as it makes all that keratin and so on. So I like to start with the B. I want a mnemonic that starts B. So my favorite mnemonic is Britney Spears glows like candy. And she truly does. But not really. I'm more of a Christina guy.